Hello, thank you for joining our webinar today on understanding carbon footprint in international moving and relocation. My name is Magali and I am Head of Marketing and Communications as well as Sustainability Manager at FIDI Global Alliance. Now, the main purpose of the session today is to help you understand why carbon measurement is such an important thing today, what your company should be doing about it, and how the FIDI Carbon Calculator project can help you in this task. Now, to be able to understand why carbon measurement is so important for your company and what you actually need to do, it is actually important to understand some very basic concepts around carbon measurement and carbon footprint, which is why I have prepared for you today a sustainability crash course. Now, for those of you who know your scopes of emissions inside out and have a good understanding of what sustainability actually means, this crash course might be a bit too basic and boring, and I do apologize. But then again, brushing up on your basics can never really hurt, can it? So a first concept that anybody who wants to get into carbon measurement really needs to understand is that of carbon footprint. Now, we've all heard the term lots of times, but do you actually really know what it means? So to make it really simple, all human activity produces greenhouse gases, and the trace of these greenhouse gases is what is known as a carbon footprint. Now, an individual person can have a carbon footprint, and so does a company, an industry, a country, or even just humanity as a whole. The most well-known greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide. You also have methane, which is, for example, linked to livestock farming or fossil fuel extraction. And then you also have nitrogen oxide, which is a byproduct of, for example, fertilizer use in agriculture. Now, the measure used to quantify these greenhouse gases is tons, or sometimes kilos, of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, important to note is that these greenhouse gases by themselves are not bad, and they have actually always existed on planet Earth. The problem is that the recent human activity over the past 50 years or so has led to an accumulation of greenhouse gases to such an extent that the Earth's system can't absorb the excess of these gases. According to scientists, this is what is driving global warming and is accelerating the climate crisis. One thing that is very important to understand, and which I will repeat several times over during this presentation, is that carbon accounting is not an exact science. Now, what I mean by this is that currently it is still very, very difficult to define and calculate which emissions exactly can be attributed to specific industrial or commercial activities. Now, the reason here for this is that for now, almost no industry has agreed on a common and a standardized approach to measuring their own activities or the impact of their activities. Take the example of a commercial flight. I don't know if you've ever tried to calculate the emissions of a flight, but if you have, you will have received very different results depending on which website you use. This is because the airline industry still has not agreed on what should be included when calculating a flight's emissions. And of course, we have the same problem in the international moving and relocation industry. For most of us, the carbon footprint concept is still a bit of an abstract term, right? So to give you an idea of what we're actually talking about and to give you a sense of proportions, here are some examples of emissions related to typical activities of our daily lives. For example, one email that took you 10 minutes to write and that you sent to 100 people will emit around 26 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. A cheeseburger will be responsible for around 3.5 kilos, again, depending on where the meat comes from and, for example, how it is heated up. A flight from Paris to New York and back will account to around 2 tons, again, depending on which website you use to calculate those emissions. An average human being over the time frame of 1 year will emit between 100 kilos if they live in Mali to around 17 tons per year if they live in the US. Now, scientists say that if we humans wanted to stay below the limit of 1.5 degrees warming, we would all need to lower the amount of emissions per year to a maximum of 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Now, if you look at it that way, the flight from Paris to New York and back does seem a bit excessive. Now, some people say in order to be able to understand our impact around us and of the choices that we make every day, we would really need to be able to develop a sort of carbon literacy. If you're interested in doing that, I very strongly recommend the book by Mike Berners-Lee called How Bad Are Bananas, that kind of give you an example of the carbon footprint of absolutely everything we do in our daily lives. Now, if you're interested in understanding your own personal carbon footprint, there are lots of tools available online for free. Two of my favorite ones are first the Footprint Calculator online tool, which is very easy to use, available in different languages. And I very strongly recommend that you do this exercise together with your family because it might just spark some interesting conversations. Another tool that I found just a few days ago is a mobile app that was developed by the United Nations called A World. It's a very, very interactive, very easy to use tool that kind of gives you tips and tricks on a daily basis on how your decisions impact the environment and what you can do about it. Now, when we talk about the carbon footprint of a company, we mean all the emissions linked to its business activities, which allows it to sell its products or its services. A company's emissions are grouped into 3 categories called scopes of emissions. This is a term that you really, really need to understand and learn about because it is key to carbon measurement and carbon accounting in general. Now, to help you understand the differences between the scopes, here's a very, very quick explanation of what the difference between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions actually is. So, Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions linked to company-owned and controlled resources, like, for example, your heating sources where you pour in your own fuels, or the fuel that you use to drive your company's owned vehicles. Scope 1 also covers, for example, refrigerants that are used in your company's air conditioning unit. Now, Scope 2 emissions are also called indirect emissions that come from the generation of purchased energy that come from your energy supplier, for example. So, in other words, Scope 2 emissions are emissions that come from the consumption of purchased electricity or steam, heat, and energy. Now, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are fairly easy to measure and report on because it's fairly easy to get the information and the data. Now, things do get more complicated when it comes to Scope 3 emissions. Now, Scope 3 emissions are all indirect emissions that happen in the supply chain of the reporting company, whether it be upstream or downstream. So, in other words, these are all the emissions that are linked to your company's operations, which you don't control directly. So, for example, in our case, it would be emissions linked to the transportation of household goods via sea or air, or the emissions linked to your packaging material, or the emissions that are generated by your employees when they commute to the office. Or for destination services, for example, we would include here emissions linked to an SIME's hotel stay or a look-see visit, for example. Now, Scope 3 emissions are really the part of carbon accounting that is very, very complicated and that all companies struggle with. But this is also where, for most of the companies, especially the big ones and those with rather large supply chains, this is where the bulk of the emissions actually lie. Now, to bring all of this closer to home and to really show you why sustainability reporting and carbon footprint measurements have become such a big thing in our industry and why Scope 3 emissions are so complicated even in our industry, I just want to show you the example of a large RMC that went through the exercise of calculating their own greenhouse gas emissions for the year of 2021. Now, this is a very, very large company with offices all over the world, but that don't have their own operational activities. So they outsource all of their operational activities. Now, no surprise here, Scope 1 and Scope 2 actually have a very small amount of emissions. This is mainly due to the fact that, well, post-COVID, a lot of their staff work from home, so they don't really use their own offices that much anymore. And again, all of their operational activities is outsourced, which means that their Scope 3 emissions are absolutely huge in comparison with their Scope 1 and Scope 2. They actually represent 98% of this specific RMC's global carbon footprint. And within the Scope 3 emissions, 3/4 are actually related to their household goods transportation activities. Now, if you remember what I said about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, this means that your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions actually are actually part of this RMC's Scope 3 emissions if you have had contracts with them. And this is where it becomes really, really complicated because, for example, this particular RMC, when they will need to report on their sustainability, on their environmental impact, and include their own carbon footprint, they will need to have access to your data to be able to calculate and report back on their own Scope 3. Now, this is a very, very important point because this will explain why the topic of sustainability reporting is becoming such a big thing, even in our industry. 3/4 of their emissions lie in their household goods operations and about 1/4 in their temporary living services. Now, all of this to show that even though they are not directly responsible for the emissions of, for example, household goods moving, they still need to be able to report on them. So I think that the RMC example has really shown you why sustainability reporting and carbon measurement has become such a hot topic over the past few years. But now, where exactly is this pressure coming from? Well, we'll see this in the next few slides. So we have seen a growing momentum around the topic of sustainability, really gaining pace, I would say, over the past 5 years. And the main reason for this is pressure coming from different sides. Of course, the first pressure point comes from clients, especially corporate clients, who are increasingly asking companies to prove their green credentials or just to show what they are doing to minimize their, especially environmental impact on our planet. The next real pressure point comes from the young generation, generally known as Gen Z, who are entering the workforce and who want to work for companies who share their strong values and their true social mission. This young generation are also the new customers who want to consume more responsible products or even services. But I would say that the main driver is definitely legislation. We are seeing across the world an increasing number of laws and regulations that are forcing companies to be more sustainable and to prove it. So, for example, over the past couple of years, we have seen over 110 countries who have committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And some of them, for example, the UK, have actually enshrined this net zero by 2050 into law. Now, leading on the sustainability front is definitely the European Union, where we are based, which launched a very, very ambitious Green Deal a few years ago. Now, this Green Deal is a package of laws and regulations that aim to make the EU as a whole carbon neutral by 2050. This Green Deal touches on every aspect of European citizens' life, and it also has a very strong focus on businesses. So from a corporate sustainability point of view, the EU is really focusing on how companies report on their impact and their efforts. So one regulation that is already now changing the way companies report on their sustainability strategies is the EU CSRD, or the European Corporate Sustainability Directive. This regulation aims to make the way companies report more transparent and in a much more streamlined way so that consumers and and legislators can actually understand what a company is doing and what its real impact actually is. The EU CSRD also puts a lot of emphasis on a company's Scope 3 emissions, which is one reason why across our supply chain we are feeling this increased pressure to report on our own company's carbon footprint. So even though this particular law, the EU CSRD, will directly affect only the very, very large companies operating in Europe in a very first phase, we can already now feel the effect on companies of all sizes everywhere in the world. One of the reasons is that the big corporate clients, or for example, the RMC that I used as an example earlier on, they, for some of them, will already have to comply with the specific law. And to be able to comply with the law, they will need to be able to report on their suppliers' carbon footprint, which in the end are all our companies together. So the fact that we can already feel this pressure became really, really clear when we saw the results of the survey we sent out to registered participants of this webinar. So to the question, have you been asked to report on your sustainability efforts? 2/3 of you said yes. And I would honestly think that the 25% who said no will see these requests come their way very, very soon. So all of this really does show that measuring and reporting on your company's emissions is something that you will have to do sooner or later, whether you want to or not, and whether you believe in climate change or not. So now that I have created the sense of urgency and hopefully convinced you about the importance for you and your company to really get going with your carbon footprint measurement and your sustainability reporting, well, it's my pleasure to present to you a brand new project developed by FIDI to help you with your carbon footprint calculation needs, the FIDI and Worldfavor Calculator project. So the main purpose of this project really is to make calculating your carbon footprint easy. So we really want to take the pain out of the basic calculation. However, important to remember is that the actual effort of collecting and inputting the data and then reporting on that still lies with you. We can't help you with that for the moment. The second purpose of launching this project really was to develop this common standard for carbon measurement in our industry. As I said at the very beginning, at the moment, practically no industry has come up with a standardized common framework that covers absolutely all of their activities. And this first calculation project really wants to be a first step towards finding a more standardized and streamlined approach to measure the activities that actually go into our industry. And then the third purpose of this project really is to continue and to build on what FIDI has been doing over the past couple of years in terms of educating and creating awareness around the topic of corporate sustainability, with a very strong focus on what does it mean in very practical terms for companies within our industry. So what can you expect? Well, first of all, don't expect the perfect solution for everybody right from the beginning. It can't be. The endeavor is too big. It won't be the perfect solution for all companies. For example, the larger companies in our industry with a large scope of activities, or many offices, or very large supply chain, or companies who already are very far ahead in their sustainability journey and already have a very good understanding of their emissions, these groups of companies will maybe find the first version of the tool maybe a bit too simple for their immediate needs. Now, having said that, our partners, Worldfavor, which is the Swedish company that is helping us set up and launch the calculator, the Worldfavor team have bespoke solutions that can be tailor-made to the needs of more complex companies that need more analysis or a more analytical approach. That will still be within the FIDI calculation project, but I do strongly recommend that you get in touch with our partners in Worldfavor. I will share the contact details at the very end of this presentation. For this very first version of the calculation tool, we really decided to focus on the basic calculation needs of any moving or relocation company, and we focus on making it easy enough to be used by those of you who are really at the very, very beginning of their sustainability journey. So as we receive feedback and gain a better understanding of what our industry really needs, we will of course expand and fine-tune the calculator, which is so important that when you use the calculator, you really share all the feedback with us so that we can adapt it. Also really important to note is that this calculator won't be the magic solution for all your sustainability reporting needs. Now, as I said already before, calculating your company's emissions is only one small part of your sustainability reporting, but it is a complicated one, and with this calculator we really want to make this specific part easy. But you will still need to collect the data that you need and ensure that it is valid all by yourself. You will also need to use the results of the calculator in your overall report based on what you need to report on, and you will still actually need to draft and create the report itself. For the moment, I'm sorry, but the calculator tool won't be able to do that for you. Now, another thing that I really want to stress, just to keep expectations realistic, is that with this calculator tool, we cannot, at this point in time, validate or certify that your results are correct. With this, I mean that the data that you use to calculate your emissions is actually correct. Now, if by any chance you're asked to provide audited results, meaning that you need a third-party verification of your results, you will need to find an external auditor to check the data by yourself, and we will very gladly work together with them to show them the methodology of the calculator in the back end. Do also know that for now, this calculator project is not part of the FIDI FAME certification procedure, meaning that it's not mandatory, and the FAME auditor will not check the results or the data that you put into the calculator. Another setting the expectations realistic here is that this calculator is not set in stone. This means that we will adapt the calculator based on the feedback that we receive from the users. We will also adapt it based on data that becomes available, which is not available right now, or based on developments in carbon accounting methodologies and legislation. So you can expect the actual calculation tool to adapt to the current context in the coming months and years. This is also very, very much a project that is based on collaboration. First of all, collaboration with our FIDI members who helped us develop the first phase of the tool. Then we also really rely on the collaboration with the users, hopefully you, to help us really fine-tune and adapt the calculator to your needs. You might also know that FIDI is part of the Coalition for Greener Mobility, together with other sister associations representing other sectors of global mobility. And the idea is to really work together with these associations to develop a more comprehensive and a wider calculation methodology to really cover the entire scope of global mobility supply chain. So what have we done so far? The first task that we tackled together with our partners from Worldfavor and our experts group from within the FIDI membership, we really tried to define the scope of the calculation of this tool, meaning when looking at the activities of an international moving or relocation company, which activities should be included in this calculation and which ones are not really relevant to this exercise. We also looked at what should we exclude maybe in a first phase and what would need to come in a second phase. Then we defined or we went about to identify the sources of reference. Behind a carbon footprint calculation, you have what are called emission factors. Those are the factors that you will need to calculate the actual greenhouse gas emission volume, or the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent related to a specific activity. Now, there are different sources and resources available in the world. We decided that our reference sources really needed to be open source and transparent, meaning that they need to be publicly available and they need to be publicly reviewed as well, which is why the main source of reference we use to define the emission factors used within the tool are from the UK authorities called DEFRA. Very important to note as well is that we have taken the decision to actually also make publicly available our own methodology, or the whole calculation and list of emission factors. The reason for this is that, first of all, it gives us more legitimacy, because we openly provide the back end of our calculation, so that specialists and those who are experts in the field of calculation can get back to us and actually help us review and adapt and ensure the credibility of the emission factors in the back. We will hold regular review processes and will invite external people and external experts to help us in this review process as well. The last step of what we did was to really fine-tune the calculator's user experience. Now, this sounds simple, but it is actually really complex, because the main challenge here really was to answer the question of how can we make it the tool as easy as possible for those companies that are really at the very beginning and don't understand much about the concept of carbon measurement, while still allowing for enough detail and granularity for those companies that are already further ahead and actually need a more detailed report. So we really try to always balance these two aspects out together, again with a technical team of Worldfavor. So what is the timeline that we are working towards? Well, it is an ambitious one. Right now, in February of this year, we have started the testing phase together with a pilot group, and we are aiming to launch the calculator to the FIDI membership as soon as March of this year. And then we will use the second half of the year to really fine-tune and expand on the current tool. We will also use the coming months to really help create this understanding on why the calculator is important and how to use it. So you can expect many more educational activities on the topic in the coming weeks and months. So I know that many of you really expected to see the first version of the calculator, and I am sorry you will still need to wait a few weeks more, but that doesn't mean that you can't already start now with preparing for when the calculator actually becomes available to you. So as I said earlier on, the actual step of calculating your company's emissions, which is basically what the calculator will help you to do, is only one part of the full process. The first, and I would almost say the most important step, is to actually collect the data that you need to be able to report on your carbon, or to measure your carbon footprint. The quality of your results really will depend on the quality of the data that you find. Now, don't worry if you can't get hold of all the data from the beginning. As I said at the beginning as well, we are all very much at the beginning of understanding the carbon footprint impact of what we do. So right now we are rather at a point of setting a sort of baseline or benchmark of our current situation. And again, as I said before, all industries are very much struggling with exactly the same questions you might be asking yourself. So don't worry too much about getting it perfect from the beginning. There will be data that you won't find, that you won't have available. Don't worry too much about it. Now, that being said, collecting data is still a really crucial step, and it's also a very time-consuming step. And it is important that you really dedicate this time and effort into getting this very first step right and as good as you can. So the first thing to do is to identify who holds the data that you actually need, whether these people are inside or outside of your company. Now, make sure that you engage with these people and that you get them to understand what you need and why you need it for. You will need to establish a process to get the correct data covering the correct period of time that you want to report on. And these processes will need to be regularly checked and verified just to make sure that you're still very much aligned. For those of you who are used to the FAME audit processes, I think this process-based approach might sound somewhat familiar. So what kind of data are we actually talking about when we tell you to go find and collect it for the tool? Well, as I explained to you at the beginning with the different scopes of emissions, the calculator will ask you to provide data related to specific activities of your company over a specific period of time. Now, you will need to define this period of time yourself, depending on what you want to report on, whether it be over a past year or only a month or whatever specific period you want to. Now, here is the list of the main groups of data or data sets that you will be able to calculate in the tool once it becomes available to you. So, for example, you have transportation of goods. Now, this relates to the activities linked to the transportation of course, household goods, but also other types of goods if your company provides these services, for example, fine art moving or office moves, etc. The data that you will need to provide is, for example, how many kilometers or miles did your trucks drive? What types of truck, if you have that data available? And this, of course, includes your own trucks, but also those used by your suppliers if you outsource some or all of these activities. Another type of data that can really be useful is how full was the truck? How many liters of diesel or petrol did your trucks use? How much weight did you transport via sea or air or whatever other transportation method you might use, and over how many kilometers? For flights, you will also need to identify whether it was a short-haul flight or a long-haul flight, meaning if it was less than 3,700 kilometers or more than that. Another important data set relates to, for example, your Scope 2 emissions, and that's linked to your energy consumption. This specifically relates to, for example, the electricity or the gas that you use in your offices or your facilities for heating or for lighting or for cooling. One way of getting this information is by looking at your yearly energy bill, where in theory, normally now most countries actually show you the total consumption of electricity or gas. Another important group of data is business travel. Now, this covers all the travel that you and your staff did for professional reasons, whether it's by plane, by train, by taxi, or any other transportation method. This also covers the number of hotel rooms that you or your colleagues stayed in different countries. Again, for flights, very important to make the decision between short-haul flights and long-haul flights. The next group, commuting, covers the means of transportation that your staff use to come to the office, whether it be by a car, their own car or the company car, or by public transportation, for example. The last big group that you will be asked to report on if you have that data available is waste. Here you will need to find data that relates to the different types of waste produced by your company, like, for example, organic or household goods or household waste, paper and cardboard, plastic, clothing, electrical waste, etc., etc. One important thing to note is that we have not included the emission calculation for packaging material for moving companies at the moment. The reason for this is that right now there are no standardized emission factors available at a global scale for the most frequently used packing material. So once we have launched the first phase of the calculator, we will immediately start working with experts in this particular field to develop bespoke emission factors related to packaging material that can be used across the world, and we do hope to be able to include this very soon in the calculator. So again, this is a lot. It can look very, very complicated, but don't worry too much. Even if you won't be able to calculate all the data, if you can't find all the data that you need, don't worry if it's not perfect from the beginning. Include what you can now, measure and calculate what you can now, and just make sure to very clearly explain in your reporting what you did not include at the moment and why you didn't include it, and what you're doing to get the missing data for the future. And then, of course, another thing that is very important and that you can continue doing now is educate yourself and others on the topic of sustainability measurement or carbon measurement and sustainability reporting. Again, as I did say before, looking at how legislation at international scale is developing, the compliance around sustainability is not going to go away and will become more and more prevalent in the corporate world. So if you want to make sure that your company stays at the top of the ball game, then I very strongly recommend that you and your staff and colleagues really try to get a grip of the general topic of sustainability and what it means for your company. Our colleagues at Worldfavor have an excellent resource library on all kinds of specific topics related to corporate sustainability. There's something in there for every level of sustainability maturity. So I strongly recommend that you go and have a look at the Worldfavor website. Over in FIDI, we also have quite a lot of assets at your disposal. For example, the FIDI Academy has a very extensive online training program on corporate sustainability, which is available free of charge for anybody working for a FIDI affiliated company. So I very strongly recommend that you take advantage of that one. We also published a series of reports and guidelines to help you understand in very practical terms what does it mean to become sustainable in international moving, and for example how the UN Sustainable Development Goals relate to the international moving industry. Both of these reports are available on the public FIDI.org website under the publications section. Thank you for joining me today in this session on understanding carbon measurement in international moving and relocation. I hope that you've gained a good understanding on why this topic is so important and urgent for anybody working in global mobility, and what your company needs to do to start measuring its impact now, and how the FIDI and Worldfavor calculation tool will help you in this task. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts or suggestions about this initiative, our team at Worldfavor, the fantastic ladies Emma and me, as well as myself, are at your entire disposal for anything that you might need. And we really encourage you to share your feedback and ideas with us so that we can really make sure that this tool is the best solution we can offer for your carbon measurement needs. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon in a future webinar or training session.